Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, the podcast for writers who strive to be bold and readers who crave something new. I'm your host, Jonathan Ball. I want to thank you for being here, and I want us to stay in touch. So subscribe to this podcast, then go to writingthewrongway.com and enter your best email to receive the Martian Embassy Missive, my bi-weekly newsletter where I let you know what's happening on Mars, where we're always making big plans. Join the Martians so you don't get left out of the invasion at writingthewrongway.com. And as a special bonus, I'll send you a free book. Speaking of books, my new book is The Lightning of Possible Storms, a collection of short fiction that reads like a novel. It includes stories about a mad scientist trying to steal his son's dreams, a story where a personification of capitalism is trying to impress his boss by winning a contest at work, a story about a Hollywood producer who just decides to adapt a bunch of explosions, and many other stories, some funny, some terrifying. Salima Nawaz says that it's cheerfully horrifying and full of the unexpected. Suzette Mayer says it's beautifully written and expertly composed. And I say, it's time you read this book. I've been working on it for almost 20 years, and I'm excited to share it with you. So please go to possiblestorms.com. Again, that's possiblestorms.com, and you'll find out a lot more about this book and some of the bonuses that you can get when you buy this book. Let's get on with the show. So I'm talking to Ryan Fitzpatrick, who has written a number of books, including Fake Math, where we find this poem, Join the Wrinkle Resistance. And so I want to talk about a couple things of this poem, Ryan. So one thing I just like to teach people and show or to discuss around is the difference between sort of how maybe an author is looking at what they're doing versus how maybe your reader is looking at what they're doing, and how, you can pull things out of a poem that maybe the author planned to put there, and also that perhaps they didn't plan to put there, and so on and so forth. And I want to kind of just get a little bit into both kind of how we might read and understand or try to interpret a poem like this, and also maybe where it's perhaps foolish to try to do some of that, but also get into maybe just kind of your writing process and what are some of the things that somebody is thinking when they're writing a poem. Now, this isn't necessarily a poem representative of how you normally write poems, but I wouldn't mind you talking a little bit just to start with about when and how you wrote Join the Wrinkle Resistance, and kind of how that's process is typical or not typical for you.
Okay. Well, and typical is weird because, like I was telling you before we got on, this poem is 16 years old. 16 years old this month. So back in 2003, 2004, when I would have been working on this book, I, like a lot of poets at that moment, were heavily invested in the blogosphere. If people can remember what the blogosphere is, that might be a new word for your students. It still seems like a new word to me, but it's ancient in kind of internet time. So what I was doing is I had a blog, and every time I would finish a poem or a draft or part of a poem, I would just post to the blog. So when you asked me this afternoon, oh, hey, will you come and talk to me about this? I immediately went and I asked myself, when exactly did I write this? So I've got archives of this blog in just Word documents. I did a really bad job archiving it. So I pulled it up and I found I wrote the poem in September 2004. And I can see what other poems I wrote at the same time and whatever. But I can guarantee, like I was telling you before, I can guarantee this poem, what would have happened is I would have had a title. I don't know why I came up with this title, or I can't remember why I came up with this title. I imagine I was taken with the idea of things being wrinkle resistant and the kind of friction in that second word. And so likely the way I would have written this is I would have plugged this into Google, plugged the phrase, join the wrinkle resistance, which I probably would have come up with because it would have sounded clever to me or cute. And I would have started responding to things in the Google results.
Let's just pause for a second. Let's just put a pin in that. and just talk briefly about why you would have been proposing in that way. So at the time, especially, as you say, one of the very common things that less conventional or more experimental writers were doing was writing in this mode that at the time was known as Flarf. So this is an example that's not maybe a pure example, but it's kind of connected to this particular poetic movement, or at least influenced by a movement that was going on at the time.
Let me split the hair a little bit.
Sure.
On that. If we think about like 2004 as a year, like what are some things people were concerned with in 2004? So one was the internet was still pretty new. So the rise of internet and information technology. Social media wasn't really a thing, although there was like Friendster and blogging was kind of social media, and there were forums, and so it's not like it didn't exist. It's just like Facebook. The word social media hadn't been coined yet. The other is like kind of post 9/11 American imperialism, the kind of stuff like the late 90s tensions around like globalization and consumerism in that sense were big. So like all that kind of going into like what they called Flarf. So Flarf was trying to respond to the post 9/11 moment where poetry was kind of obsessed with being really earnest and sincere and being used as a tool to kind of process a national trauma. So there was an outpouring of poetry in that moment. And so there was this group of poets in the States, and they started before 9/11, but it kind of became a thing right after 9/11, where they were on a listserv, another kind of like early internet word for you. And they were trading poems back and forth. And the way they were writing the poems, or the way they ended up writing the poems, is they started this thing called Google Sculpting. And I can't remember who, maybe it was Gary Sullivan or something, but because I wasn't on the listserv, so I don't consider myself a Flarf poet, but I was certainly influenced by them. Is they figured out if they started punching just like absurd things into Google, when Google was still developing, Google was not perfect at that point. You can't do this with Google now because Google's algorithm is too good at finding what you want. So if you punched absurd things into Google, you get like a weird mix of different search results, like things you wouldn't want if you were actually. So I remember this wasn't Flarf, but it was kind of at the same time. There was this internet game called Google Whack. Do you remember that?
No.
So Google Whack was somebody had to put up a website with it too. Maybe it still exists, but where people would try to find 2-word pairings that would only give you a single result. So and Flarf would work on the same principle. So maybe to write your poem, you'd try to pair a couple words that don't normally go together. So maybe you would go pepperoni unicorn, popsicle genocide, and you would pair these, and then you would get these weird search results, and then you would try to process through it, and you would try to write these poems that were purposely bad.
Now, what I want to just point out, though, so you say they're purposely bad, and again, this was in many respects the intention, but there's a sort of a comic procedure involved here, where you're just almost trying to get something so bad it's good, right?
Yeah.
And taking that sort of ethos or that aesthetic, I guess, suppose you'd say, into poetry. And one of the things that I think is interesting about this approach, and why I was really interested in this type of writing at the time myself, was if you take, pepperoni unicorn, your example. What's interesting about that bizarre example is it's a very good image. It's very unique. It's very specific. You can envision it. You can draw a picture of it. All the things that would make a poetic image good are there. It just is ridiculous and absurd. It has a certain insane, surrealistic absurdity to it, and it's kind of comical as well. But if you just take the things, so it's hard to be serious with it. But if you take those things, if you take the tone away and try to be serious with it, you get all these interesting, weird results. And so, as you're saying, this kind of process, so creative writers listening to this maybe as you were saying, it's almost impossible to really do this with Google anymore because, but for a time it was very, very possible. And I think you can still manufacture this kind of thing. You just can't really do the same procedure.
Like, I don't think like Google sculpting invented this, right? I think because like I was trying to think this afternoon, like after you asked me, what were the influences on like a poem like this for me? And one of the other ones, other than Flarf, was thinking about like poets interested in like improvisational writing or procedural writing, like forms that allowed for a certain kind of negativity. And let me say, when I use the word negativity, I don't mean like sad or bad or anything like that. By negativity, I mean like you're trying to get rid of knowing what the outcome's going to be before you jump into something. So John Keats famously had the idea of negative capability. You're trying to write in a way that you might not understand why you're writing.
You just froze there, Ryan. So just I'm just going to see if I can prevent you from freezing. So sorry, can you just repeat what you just said because you froze on my end?
Oh, sorry. So I was thinking about poets who like kind of indulged or like were pursuing this sense of negativity. So I was thinking about like Fred Waugh. He has this great book, Music at the Heart of Thinking, where he likens it to like it's improvisational writing. It's like jazz, or he calls it like drunken Tai Chi. Or something like William Carlos Williams' Cora in Hell, where he famously would come home from work. He was a physician. He would come home from work, and at like 11:30 or at night, whenever he would get home, he would like bash out and improvise like on his typewriter, like a small prose paragraph, and then he would accumulate them. Or like Jax McLeod, who would just come up with these wild procedures to just generate text, and the text might not mean anything, but it was like the making of the procedure that was the important part.
And it also becomes possible to pull meaning out of it, even if it doesn't intentionally mean something as well. But just to before we get back to kind of interpreting this poem or how we might look at it and read it, so just to jump back to your procedure, so you plug join the rank resistance into Google. You come up with that phrase, just with this sort of wordplay on wrinkle resistant pants or whatnot. Plug it into Google. You start, as you say, at the time, what Google would give you is a bunch of disparate results that didn't really match each other, and we're using different kind of registers of language. And then that was the important part, was the mix of registers or mix of like social textures. Then what? Then how do you actually put that sculpt it as Google sculpt, as the word suggests? How do you actually kind of sculpt that into a poem?
So I would start with, or I would either start with, or I would like slowly drift into a kind of container. Like I'd have to have almost a preset container for it. So that's why if you pick up a copy of Fake Math and look at, especially the shorter poems, they'll all often be like really regular. Like this one's in couplets. Like some of them will be in like tercets or quatrains, and that's literally just like to give myself like a limit. And to give it a bit of like, by containing it, you give it a bit of tension, like to what you can include. So you have to include as much good stuff as you can in that tiny container. And so like the way I would write poems like this is I would like kind of improvise out these things, and rather than like edit them later, I would just write a ton of them, and the ones that sucked, I would just throw away. So I think like I probably wrote twice as much work as actually went in the book, and cut like a ton of stuff like as I went, just to figure out what actually worked and what didn't, or what produced something interesting.
Sure, and then even though you're doing these kind of experimental approaches, you are also doing some very standard or conventional poetic techniques. As you say, you're using couplets, these 2-line stanzas. They're roughly, you're not really counting the meter or anything, but they're roughly the same length. I still do this. I was using the ruler at the top of the page on Microsoft Word. Well, you also are using enjambment. Like, so the line, you've got easy care sheets combine hot sex with wheat. You like that wheat? That's an example of enjambment there, carrying that over. And a really common technique that poets use for enjambment is to have that kind of, when you have that pause, hot sex with, and then the completion on the next line is an unexpected, move. It's a joke structure where we have sort of this, punchline in a manner of speaking, with the last word completing, the first part in a surprising, the setup in a surprising manner. But it's also a just a standard technique that we see with enjambment. So despite all experimental approaching, you do have some very conventional sort of structuring here.
Yeah.
Why is that important, though?
I think it's an anchor, right? Like it's an anchor. It's partly an anchor for me and an anchor for the reader. So like if I went and did, and you can do this, and I've read lots of work that's really exciting that kind of like, you like on every level, it's like doing something like wild or unexpected. But I think it can be really useful to kind of like use something normative as an anchor. So it gives me like, in terms of like, it makes writing the poems quicker to like do it in couplets, for instance, or to limit the line size in a certain way, which allowed me, like, I didn't have to think about everything. Like I could like it's the difference between like a pre-planned set of steps in a dance and the kind of improvisational moments, right? So you need to have one to get the other, because they play off each other. But I also think like the fact that this poem is in couplets maybe makes it more approachable to a reader because it's recognizable in a certain way. So it gives a reader a certain kind of anchor, right?
What I like to talk about when I teach this poem, generally speaking, is I'll point out that you have, in many ways, again, a conventional container here. It's kind of conventional structuring. Like, as you say, it looks kind of like a poem that we would normally encounter. It has a lot of the techniques we normally see. But then when you actually read it, so like there's a moment, I think, before you read it where you might think you're looking at a normal poem. And then you read it and it's baffling. And the reason it's baffling is for a few reasons. But I think one core reason is you really have this language of advertising here, or this kind of hype speak almost that we encounter, and more normally we encounter this in advertising, like the exclamation marks, don't be a schmo, free small molecules, join the linen revival, join the linen revival is could just pull, or retire your iron. Like these are the kinds of things that we could easily see in just an advertising billboard, or,
and some of that might have literally just come out of a Google search result and I just dropped it in.
It could have been like in a Google ad for, I can't remember if they had Google ads at the time, but
I think they did. And they were more visible. I don't think I used the ads, but like, cause I usually would just use like the snippets on the search results.
Well, how I like to point out, how I like to read this poem or teach this poem or analyze it is I'll say to people, what you're normally trained to do is when you encounter a poem, you're trained to look deeply into it and pull the meaning out of it. But this poem won't allow that, because there is nothing beneath the surface of this language, in a manner of speaking. It's the kind of junk language that we see in advertising, where everything is on the surface. Because if in advertising, you need everything on that surface to make sense. And in a sense, I think the point of the poem comes across in how, in this disjuncture between how we're normally trained to read a poem, and then here's a poem that refutes our normal attempts to read it. Instead, we're looking at this advertising language, this junk language. I like to call it junk language for the purpose of this example. But it's now in a poem format. And in the poem format, it demands and insists on being read in this deep manner. And so you get this interesting way in which I think it starts to, like, if you're paying attention and thinking about it, it starts to sort of insist that you think about your encounters with language. Here's the language you would normally encounter in the normal world. But here we are in the poem where we don't normally encounter normal language. Instead, we encounter a heightened language where everything means more. And yet here we have, the language we're seeing here is refuting that, is making that sort of normal encounter with the poem difficult, even though it's kind of closer in many ways to how we normally encounter language in the normal world. So you get a sort of, I think it kind of cuts both ways. I think the poem in some ways suggests that our normal encounters with language are empty and senseless. And in a sense, you could read the poem as being critical of the kind of normative way that we use and encounter language in the world, where we're really communicating with one another only to sell each other things. But you also look at it in a different respect, whereas here's a poem that maybe is critiquing poetry for being out of touch with the language of the world. The language we normally find in a poem lacks humor and surprise and this value that the junk language we encounter on a billboard has so often. And yet, poetry is supposed to be the highest form of language, and yet the language in poetry is almost always now so overused and overwrought. And in a weird way, it's trying to be very emotionally expressive, and yet it's kind of sapped of emotion. Because here is where we sell our emotions. So I think that's an interesting poem that kind of, on a certain level, means nothing, and on another level, it's sort of asking you to think about how poems tend to operate in order to mean anything, and how they use language in a sense that they use language, emotional language, to advertise emotions, and get you to buy them, in a manner of speaking, or at least buy the brand of me as a person who has deep feelings and thinks deep thoughts. But then at the same time, I think can be seen as critical of that kind of junk, how we've junkified the language in the world. There's all sorts of ways in which you could see it. You could see it both as celebrating this kind of advertising junk language, or as denigrating poetry for not using it, or just being kind of bound up in this whole capitalist exchange. Here's the poem where we're supposed to be free of the whole capitalist exchange of, since poems are worth nothing, and so on. And yet it's still in that whole structure is so it's so wrapped up in it. It's an interesting poem to me because it kind of operates on all these meta levels, even as it kind of refuses to operate on like a normal level in a certain sense. I don't know what you think about that interpretation, but
yeah, sure. I told you I was going to say whatever you say.
Yeah, whatever. So it's fine. Well, but are you even thinking about these things when you're writing, though? Because these are the kinds of things I know that you've thought about.
Like in that kind of like, I don't think, oh man, this poem's going to create a dialectic between the way the way language works in poetry and the way that language works in consumerism, man. That's not, but that's in the background, right? Like I was going to say, the thing that maybe, like, if any of your students are looking for an essay topic, I'd like to see this essay on the way gender works in this poem as well. Because I think, because reading this now, I'm reading this like 16 years after writing it, and I go, oh yeah, there's a lot like going on with gender, like the way the treatment and the maintenance of fabrics is totally like this form of supposedly feminine labor, but also the weird like boner jokes in the margins of the poem, and there's this kind of toxic masculinity at work. So but again, like I wouldn't have written that thinking, oh, I'm taking down toxic masculinity, man. I would have thought, oh, here's a funny boner joke that I could put in this poem.
Well, or even just here's a move where I can surprise the person going from one line to the next. I think when
or that I'm surprising myself as I write it.
But it's not that you can't. I think something's really important to understand, both writer, but also just for the reader, is that when a writer is actually sitting down to write something, a lot of their highfalutin ideas about, what they are trying to do in this piece of work are just going to get in their way. And ironically won't help them produce anything that does anything. Like here's a poem that actually does work on these meta levels. But if you were to sit down and try to do that in a certain sense, like you could have it in the back of your head as like, that's your project. Cause that is in many ways, like you have certain things that are like your, project that maybe you're doing in a book or you're just kind of doing in your life as a writer. You're always sort of returning to the same few things often as a writer, at least, in certain periods. But if you have them too front of mind, they start to paralyze you and you start to overthink and overanalyze and all the fun and the visceral quality of the work starts to bleed away from it a bit. It's a weird sort of approach, I think, that you often have to take as a writer, where you have to kind of be loose enough and kind of be improvising enough, as you say, that and playing where you're just trying to get an interesting effect, or you're just trying to get some interesting wordplay going, or you're just trying to have it kind of feel a certain way, or be fun in a certain respect. And if you can do that, if you can kind of like keep on the process level, I find, then it makes possible all these different levels for the reader.
Yeah.
But if you try to control them too much as a writer and manipulate the reader too much, I think there's almost a weird way in which the reader can feel it, and they start to rebel and like think different things than you want them to think, or what have you. It just seems too didactic. So, but I think a lesson for just a person who's maybe not a writer and even just more interested in reading or looking at poetry or fiction or what have you, is that there is this sort of distinct difference between like maybe what a writer is trying to do and what they're actually doing.
Yeah.
And sometimes it aligns, and you've got like you see writers who have a real keen control of things to a certain degree, but so often I think it helps to like loosen your grip a bit and allow the thing to develop its own. Like if it works as a poem, in a manner of speaking, it'll be doing a lot of this thematic work, whether you intended to or not.
Well, and you can, like, as a writer, you can kind of sweep the text up in the edit too, right? So like your initial kind of like approach at a piece or at like a chunk of a piece can be kind of loose and improvisational, but maybe you begin to see like the thematics, or you see like the larger formal concerns, or the kind of architecture of a text later, after you've written all the individual pieces. And then you can go, oh, this piece doesn't fit, I'll just not include it. Or, oh, this piece could fit if I just do another edit and like rewrite it with all this other stuff in mind. Like, so there's like, that's the other thing, right? It's not like a poem gets written in a single stroke of genius. It's that it's often written in like stages. Even though I just said I wrote this poem in 15 minutes.
Well, I mean, it can happen that you just churn it out. It happens, right? Especially if you're doing a bunch of things like that. You write 200 poems, then like, okay, a couple of them will get written in 15 minutes, front to back.
Well, even if you wrote 200 poems, even if you wrote 200 poems, 15 minutes each, and went back and like went, well, of these 200 poems, maybe 100 of them work. And that's the book. The rest can go in a file somewhere, and somebody can dig them out of your archive after you're dead. Aren't these crappy poems good?
Maybe they are, if he's famous enough.
Yeah.
What I find so often in the editing process is it becomes a problem of seeing what the thing is.
Yeah.
In its essential nature, like what is it at its core the most like? It sounds like a sculpting metaphor. Yeah, in a manner of speaking.
Reveal.
Like, I feel like so much of editing, in the editing process, when it's going well, is just figuring out like, how do I make this thing more like what it is?
Yeah.
Whether that's adding things or taking them away or changing them or just leaving well enough alone. Like, how do I get it closer to like what it is, rather than trying to make what I want it to be?
Yeah.
Or what, I think it is, or, thought it was initially, or what have you. So for you, I want to do a little bit of a thing where I ask students to think about ask a couple questions of this poem. So I'm going to ask you questions about your own poem that I would normally ask students. So some of these you've kind of asked already, but here's a question for you, Ryan.
Yeah.
What's the difference between the language you encounter in poetry and the language you encounter in advertising?
Social texture. So like, I wouldn't have had this language when I wrote this poem, but like the further I get away from it, the more I think about what I did in this book and like in my other book, and what I do in a lot of my work is I often work through collage. And to work through collage, you have to think about like, what's the kind of visual texture of the thing I'm working with? Or if you're creating a quilt, you might work with fabrics that have different textures, right? So like when you're creating a poem through collage, you have to think about like, what are the textures I'm playing with? And I like to put that social in front of it because it reminds me that textures come from somewhere. And what I mean by social texture is when it sounds like this kind of like highfalutin theory term, but like it's as simple as like when you read a book from one place or from one context, it's often going to have a different kind of vibe than a different book. Like if you read an instruction manual for your oven, that's going to have a different texture, like a different vibe, a different texture than if you read like Harry Potter. Oh, I shouldn't mention Harry Potter. It's like, cause fuck J.K. Rowling. But when you read like a children's novel, right? So like it's interesting to like mix social textures. So I think like when you ask like what's the difference between the language of advertising and the language of poetry, part of me wants to say there isn't one, but part of me wants to say, well, they have a different like expected social texture. So like the language of advertising really can be anything, but it'll often have qualities that will like try to convince you, like they're rhetorically trying to convince you of something, right? Whereas poetry often works in this kind of romantic mode where it's like talking about feelings or has this kind of narrative pull, or it might have like a metrical regularity to it. There's a kind of texture we think poetry should have, and poetry often doesn't have that. I feel like I haven't answered your question at all.
No, I think that answers the question, but I think the other thing that kind of maybe clarifies the answer is when we take one and move it to the other. Like if we take the advertising language and put it in the poem, now we can see the difference between the social texture. The language is the same.
Yeah.
It's just been moved from one location to the next, and the expectation has changed. So you can see some of the ways we approach the language differently. So in advertising, of course, for example, the language is not trying to draw attention to itself as language.
Yeah.
Because that gets in the way of selling you something. But in poetry, of course, it's always trying to draw attention to itself as language because it's trying to sell itself. It's trying to sell the language to you. And the skill with the language and so on. And so what it hides in poetry is the operation of salesmanship as it's displaying like the language to you. Whereas, the reverse is the case in advertising. And so there's other questions. You answered most of the other questions I typically would ask a student to think about already. But how do we interpret wrinkle resistance? No, it's perfect. But we'll talk about wrinkle resistance. So that's the sort of phrase that everything stems from. But I ask all people to just think of like what would it even mean for there to be wrinkles. And of course, the word
there's no wrinkles in your pants.
Yeah, it operates on the level of my computer's telling me my connection to you is unstable.
Yeah, you've been wobbling.
It's an unstable collection. So that's nice, great phrase, piece of
just
language.
Just like a poem, right?
Yeah, but of course, there's the resistance of like you don't have wrinkles now, but there's also like the idea that like we've joined the resistance, right?
Yeah, like
there's a revolutionary. Yeah, and it's so often, of course, what advertising is trying to do is substitute is to sell you the kind of emotional feeling of being part of a revolution or a movement or a cause. But really it's just, so that it can milk you of money, in a cult-like manner, having pulled you emotionally into this sort of scenario.
Yeah. For instance, did you know that Ben and Jerry's just started a new podcast?
No.
About the history of white supremacy in America?
That's it.
That's it right there,
a joke?
Right? That's not a joke. That's a real thing. Amazing. That happened in 2020.
Wow. That's interesting. Yeah. That's
I really racked
the rebel cell right there.
They're trying to name the ice cream flavor that goes with it, but I couldn't think of one that didn't personally offend me.
Wow. That's fascinating. But, that sort of breakdown between where everything is advertising, even this, poem now, where we normally would go to, again, feel as if we've escaped from the rat race or escaped from, this is supposed to be our private time with our own thoughts. And yet it's been kind of colonized in a manner of speaking, whether we, that there's sort of no escape in a certain sense, because even the poet is trying to sell us on, their epiphany about the world where, we just can't escape. It's an interesting poem, I think, and I like to teach it because it really does display how you can have no content in a poem, in a certain sense, and yet still have a lot of poetic depth there in a weird sort of way, and a lot to think about.
I disagree with that. There's lots of content in this poem.
Sure,
there's just no single unifying message in this poem.
Sure,
no
that's a better way to put it. Yeah, there's a lot of content.
But the lyric heave at the end is against your junk's secret hiding pocket. What does that even like it's resisting closure and resisting unity, but there's lots of content.
Well, and just to bring it back to the title a bit, in some ways I think it's kind of resisting, almost ironically, instead of resisting wrinkles, it's almost insisting on the wrinkles. And kind of, it's as if the wrinkles themselves are the ones forming the resistance.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for talking to me, Ryan, and I appreciate it.
Thanks, buddy.
And have a good day.
Yeah. Turn your cameras off, students.